Well, good evening, ladies, gentlemen, members. Welcome to tonight's meeting of the Planning Policy Local Plan Committee, which has been held here in the committee room in the Clacton Town Hall. Please be informed that this meeting will be broadcast live, and the recording of that will be available soon after on the council website. We don't have a planned fire drill this evening, so if a fire alarm should sound, please follow officers out the doors and congregate in the front outside the main building. Officers in attendance this evening are from our left, Miss Lisa Hastings, Monitoring Officer, Miss Bethany Jones, Democratic Service Officer, Mr. Gary Guyver, Corporate Director of Planning, Mr. Paul Woods, Planning Policy Team, Mr. Will Fuller, Senior Planning Policy Officer, Miss Katie Copperfield, who's supporting our meeting. This evening we have 3 items on the agenda, which I will introduce when we get to that point on the agenda. But before we do, I'd just like to give mine and the committee thanks to the officers for their work in having sifted through 620 responses to the recent consultation and produced a very comprehensive report in front of us. So a big thank you to the team. We now go to our agenda. Agenda item 1 is apologies and substitution. Bethany.
Thank you, Chair. I have received apologies from Councillor Mark Stevenson with Councillor Sudra substituting and Councillor Newton with no substitution.
Thank you very much indeed. The next item is minutes from our last meeting, which was held on the 26th of January in this room. Members, can I sign them as a true record? Agenda item 3 is declaration of interest. Any members who have an interest to declare? Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Chairman. Relating to MSA 27 on the extra sheet, the Wicks, I'd like to declare, I'm certain is a non-pecuniary interest. The blue hatched area is owned by my son. Thank you.
That's noted. Thank you very much. Next item is public speaking. Bethany, we have 2 speakers tonight, if I'm correct.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, that's correct.
So we have Miss Claire Taylor, she's going to speak on A1, and Mr. Will Vogt, who was going to speak on A2. Agenda item 6 is A1, report to the Corporate Director, Planning and Community, Tendring District Local Plan Review. Overview of the main matters raised during the public consultation of the preferred opt-in draft. This is on pages 21 to 366 of the agenda. The report was prepared by Gary Guyver, Jacob Sharma, Jasma, Haley Sargent and Paul Woods, and it will be presented by Mr. Guyver and Mr. Woods. I would like to commend officers for the way in which they have engaged with the public during the 6-week consultation, with 5 drop-in sessions throughout the district, with a wealth of officers on hand who were there to answer questions and clarify points from the 300-400 people attended total. So well done. And also for the excellent way in which you engaged with the parish and town councils. That was exemplary, because that took out quite a lot of the issues, and people were able to understand firsthand what was being proposed in their areas and the impact that would have. So another well done to the team. The responses summarised on pages 45 to 69, and the summary of the technical responses are summarised on page 69 to 90. The full comments are on appendices 1 to 17. Before we do the report, I will call on Mrs. Taylor to speak. If you'd like to make your way to the microphone, please. You will have, if you take a seat if you like. You'll have 3 minutes, and Bethany will give you a prompt when time's up. That's it. Yeah.
Okay, testing. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
That's got that bit. Thank you. Okay. Chair, members of the committee and officers and fellow members of the public, good evening. My name is Claire Taylor and I'm speaking on behalf of Lawford Tie Action Group in strong support of Lawford Parish Council's proposal to give Lawford Tie Field protected status. Every day you see people heading towards this field. Coming up from Grange Road, the rural character unfolds and you feel the shift from built-up Lawford into the open countryside. And looking at the criteria for protected status, Lawford Tie Field meets every one of them. Heritage, beneath the grass pasture lies a prehistoric henge, a 4,000-year-old scheduled ancient monument as important as Stonehenge. It's a unique living piece of Lawford's history, and there are only 4 henges as old as this in East Anglia. And protecting its setting is a clear national priority. Landscape quality. This is Lawford's true green boundary. It marks the transition from village to countryside. Its long views, tranquility and rural character are exactly what protected status is designed to safeguard. With biodiversity, the field supports species of principal importance as identified under Section 41 of the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act 2006. Such as the lunar yellow underwing moth, as well as bats, skylarks and other wildlife, and this has been recognised by a planning inspector following a previous appeal dismissal. For the community, around 200 people use the field daily, all kinds of recreation. The mental health benefits of a peaceful, accessible green space are enormous, and it's connected to 2 other already protected spaces, the Tendring Showground on one side and the School Lane Recreation Ground on the other. And residents have told us that losing this field would seriously affect their quality of life. For public value, an unprecedented number of objections to a current planning application, 663 to date, shows exactly how much Lawford Tie Field matters. People care deeply about this place and they could reasonably hope it could be protected. And the vulnerability, planning applications both in 2016 and this year show that this field is under real threat. So for Lawford Tie Action Group, this is not our first rodeo. That cumulative pressure is precisely why protection and safeguarding is needed. Protecting Lawford Tie Field is about protecting heritage, biodiversity, landscape, well-being and trust in the democratic local plan process. So dear members and officers, we urge you to consider granting protected status and send a clear message that this community, its well-being and its heritage are worth defending. Thank you.
Ms. Taylor, thank you very much indeed. Well inside the 3 minutes. If you'd like to make your way back to the gallery, thank you. There are no further speakers on this item, so I'll go straight to Officer Paul and Gary. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you to Ms Taylor for the comments. We may well pick up on some of those at some point during the 2 presentations, but of course aware of the current planning application and noting that the comments made are very consistent with some of the representations that have been made on the local plan as well. So thank you very much. So good evening. Chairman, councillors, ladies and gentlemen. So in February and March of this year, we carried out 6 weeks formal public consultation on the preferred options draft of the local plan. And through this report, officers are providing a broad overview of the main issues and matters that were raised directly through formal responses to the consultation, alongside some of the feedback we picked up from various meetings and exhibitions that we attended, and some of the notable message that was circulating on social media and in the press. When we carried out the consultation, we knew that this plan was going to be unpopular locally because of the significant amount of additional housing development the council is now having to plan for following the change in government policy and the imposition of new mandatory targets by the government. Targets that are so high that we have needed to put forward radical proposals for development in locations that probably wouldn't have even been on the table at all if not for the change in government policy, and certainly not for a few more years to come anyway. The majority of concerns raised by our residents and communities in response to this local plan are fair and reasonable, and they broadly reflect the concerns both councillors and officers here have raised, ourselves in our previous meetings and discussions, and in the council's objection, of course, to the government when it introduced the new top-down target approach. People are understandably concerned about the capacity of our transport and utilities infrastructure and our schools and medical facilities. They're concerned about environmental impacts and whether the homes are actually needed and whether they'll be realistically developed. Ensuring homes are matched by jobs and are affordable to meet the needs of local people, not just incomers to the district, are also chief amongst local concerns. The permanent loss of productive farmland to new development, given our limited supply of brownfield land, and the impact on the character of our towns and villages. All fair and reasonable concerns, some of which we can address and mitigate by having the right policies in the local plan and through the effective use of planning obligations and conditions when granting planning permissions, but other impacts are simply unavoidable when dealing with these scales of development. But despite the understandable concerns and objections, the Council has responsibilities around planning and a statutory duty to prepare a local plan and to keep it up to date. And whilst there are some that say we should stand up to the government and tell them we don't want all this development and won't be pushed around, we know it's not that easy. And so realistically, we have to produce the best plan we can under the circumstances, knowing that it won't be perfect, knowing that it won't be popular, but also knowing from our bitter experience of the past with speculative planning applications and planning appeals that the consequences of not having an up-to-date local plan are far worse. Only last week we saw planning permission granted on appeal against the council's wishes for a scheme of 30 homes on greenfield land in one of our protected strategic green gaps off Slabberys Lane in Holland. Because the housing targets have shot up, we cannot currently demonstrate a 5-year housing supply, and the new local plan is still progressing through the process. Now, whilst we know we have to comply with government policy, we still want a local plan that reflects, as best as we can, local considerations. And with that in mind, we've had a good proactive engagement with our town and parish councils, as the chairman alluded to earlier, to help shape the plan, engage with residents at exhibitions and public meetings, and ensure we pick up the things that matter locally. In the report for later on this evening, you will see that the input of town and parish councils has had an important bearing on some of the possible changes to the plan that we might consider in due course. And I do thank myself, the town and parish councils, for their guidance, cooperation, and their unique insight into local issues, which I hope will continue going forward. So overall, the comments that we received from residents and communities across the district come as no surprise. And whilst we think it's fair to suggest that we're sympathetic and share many of the concerns that have been raised, the key tests for a local plan are the tests of legal compliance and soundness, including conformity with national policy. And just because a particular proposal is unpopular and attracts lots of objections does not necessarily mean that it's unsound. And you will note that we have listed the 8 most objected to proposals in the report, with the development in Brightlingsea topping the list. It is often the comments raised by statutory consultees and technical bodies such as governmental bodies like Natural England, Historic England, National Highways and the Environment Agency, partners in the NHS, emergency services, Essex County Council and others, and utility providers like Anglian Water that can highlight those legal compliance and soundness issues that could cause a plan to fail if not taken seriously and addressed. Now, despite the significant challenge before us and the radical approach the council has had to take in trying to produce a plan that meets with the government expectations around housing growth, officers are encouraged by the supportive and constructive tone of the representations received from statutory consultees and technical bodies, and their guidance and cooperation. And because they are so important in the consideration of the plan's legal compliance and its soundness, we've actually attached them in full as appendices to Report A1. as I believe members of the public in particular will be interested in what they have said. For example, the comments from Essex County Council in respect of transport and education, and those of the NHS and the Integrated Care Board in respect of health, setting out the strategic priorities for how the provision of healthcare will likely change in the future. These representations from partners and technical bodies are very useful in providing constructive suggestions, but they also identify some specific matters of a fundamental nature that will require serious attention in considering potential changes to the plan later on. The holding position of Essex County Council and National Highways in respect of the garden villages at Hare Green and Horsley Cross, pending completion of the next phase of transport modelling, is arguably the biggest issue for which only further work will enable us to reach a firmer view in due course. Now, the comments from landowners, developers and planning agents naturally tend to either support the plan if their site or their client's site is part of the allocation of land for development, or they'll object in the strongest terms to the soundness of the plan if their sites haven't been included in the plan, or if they consider any of the policies to be onerous or potentially unviable. And it's not uncommon for landowners, developers and planning agents to make a completely opposite argument to our residents and communities in their representations. And when it comes to the examination of a local plan, it is not uncommon for the council to find itself stuck somewhere in the middle of that argument and being the target of criticism from both sides. And because it is often in the financial interest of landowners, developers and planning agents to challenge the legal compliance and soundness of the local plan, they will approach the consultation and the examination processes in a thorough, objective and often very well-resourced manner, sometimes with legal representation and expert consultant support. Their ability to find weaknesses in a local plan and persuade a planning inspector that there are issues with legal compliance and soundness should not be underestimated. I will now ask Paul if you could go into more detail, including the report's recommendations. So I'll hand over to Mr. Woods. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Just before we go, members, is there any questions from anyone to Gary on his presentation? Councillor Suter.
Thank you, Chairman. Just need some clarity as to how we have come to this position in the local plan. Was it that after parish council meetings, did something need to change and therefore consultations, or did something else happen?
Thank you, Councillor Sudra. So the position that we've reached with the local plan is we've completed what is the second of 3 statutory consultation stages. So the first one we did, issues and options 2025. The consultation that we're reporting on now is a statutory round of consultation where we need to do the consultation, need to take the comments into account. And a lot of the challenges that I've highlighted in terms of the amount of growth that's required and the difficulties that we're having, in having to come up with a strategy for so much growth, they come about as a result mainly of a changing government policy that happened following the last general election, where the government introduced mandatory house building targets. And that has naturally become a bit of a focus of the discussions that we've had when we've been out to the communities as part of the consultation.
Thank
Councillor
you.
Everett.
Thank you. You mentioned Essex County Council was going to be key in the next phase of the development of this plan. Are there any extra challenges in the fact that the political control of Essex County Council has changed very recently? Are there expected to be any problems as a result of that?
Well, the only comment.
Gary.
Yes, well, the only comment I make that is I can't comment specifically on whether a change in the political administration of the county authority will change the way this is approached. But what we are doing at the moment is we work very closely with the county council, particularly on the matters relating to highways and transport and other matters which you'll see in the representation. And of course, when we progress to the next stage of consultation on the plan, our colleagues in Essex will naturally be a statutory consultee at that stage as well.
Councillor Bush.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, question really to you, Gary. The situation you mentioned earlier regarding the appeal in Slabberys Lane, because of our current situation, when I look through the reviews here, is that we're not indicating to actually go to the inspectorate probably until the end of 26 at the best. In your anticipation, how long would it take from there to actually get a plan adopted or accepted, agreed? That's the first part of the question. And because we're obviously extent of the current plan, it's in a draft situation. I think it's something like 3.8 houses rather than the 5,000 houses or 550 houses. We're short of that 5-year housing supply. How does that affect in this current situation, more in the draft, with the policies? Are they going to be challenged because it's not a current plan? That's a real question that I'm really concerned about, because there's so many different policies in there that could be challenged, and how do we stand with the weighting against that and the worthiness? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bush. No, they're excellent questions, because we are still in a point of transition between plans. When we are dealing with planning applications, the rules state that you can, this is in the National Planning Policy Framework, you can give weight to an emerging plan depending on really 3 factors. One, the stage it's reached in terms of the process. And as I mentioned before, you know, we've reached the sort of second consultation stage, we've completed that, and now we're working towards the submission stage. The second is the amount and the nature of comments that have been received through consultation. So, for example, if a particular policy has attracted a lot of objection to it that raises pertinent points, you may not be able to give it as much weight in the determination of applications as a policy that perhaps has attracted little attention or has received an amount of support. And the third factor is the one that I always forget about, but it's the alignment with national policy. The more aligned your local policies are, even if they're an emerging plan, to national planning policy, the greater the weight that you can attach to them. Now, in the determination of any planning application, which is, of course, not the responsibility of this committee, we have the planning committee that looks at those, they have to consider how much weight to give to policies in making decisions on those applications. In terms of where we are in the process and how much longer before we get to a stage where we have an adopted local plan that can carry full weight, well, the process set out here on in is that we need to get the local plan submitted to the Secretary of State by the end of this year. Now, how long it takes to actually progress through an examination and get an adopted local plan out the other end is to an extent out of our hands, because it will be over to the inspectorate to be able to resource and have the capacity to deal with the examination. But our working assumption is that that would happen in 2027. But we've reached a stage where we've done one stage of consultation, and it may be that an additional element of weight could be attached to the use of certain policies. When we get through the next stage of consultation, which will be the submission stage of consultation, a bit more weight again could be added. Once we've got it submitted to the Secretary of State, a bit more weight again, but you're still always working towards a position where you have an adopted plan that you can attach full weight to. So it's not inconceivable that we will remain in a vulnerable position in regards to housing supply position and the need to take difficult decisions on planning applications for a number of months to come, and certainly through the period of time while we're working up to the examination and adoption of a local plan.
If I could come back as well, really, it's regarding where our current position is in terms of the amount of houses that were actually in the system and the shortfall. How regularly is it be reviewed by ourselves, by the government, and if we fall dramatically below that line, obviously there's penalties with additional housing required. How does that work, and how is that reviewed during this transitional process in terms of like keeping up to space with it?
Thank you, Councillor Bush. If you'll forgive me and allow this, I think this might be a question that's better picked up in the second report, actually, because under the second report, we are going to talk a bit specifically about the housing numbers and how they're going to change. Thank you.
Thank you. I will pause the meeting for a little while whilst Ms Hastings has a word with Councillor Chapman about a declaration. So if we can stop the recording for a little while, please, and allow Councillor Chapman, if you like, to gentlemen, members, if we get the recording back, yeah, thank you very much. I will hand over to Ms Hastings, who's just going to give us a technical point. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Chairman. And following Councillor Chapman's declaration of interest, which related to Report A2, in that a piece of land specifically referred to in the update sheet is owned by her son, that means that it would become under the definition of non-registrable interests, and the matter directly affects the subject matter of that interest, and therefore the Code of Conduct does require Councillor Chapman to withdraw at the point of A2. But if Councillor Chapman wishes to, she can come back for A3, but I'll leave that up to her. Thank you.
I think that's quite clear. Thank you for clarifying the position. Now we got back to our report. Over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. As Gary's already set out the overall picture from the consultation, I'll just focus in a bit more detail on what sits behind that, particularly the scale of the responses, where they've been focused, and what we should be taking from them in planning terms. In terms of the overall scale of engagement, we've received around 620 formal submissions to the preferred options consultation, alongside engagement with around 700 individuals through public exhibitions, public meetings and other events. And so this represents a substantial and meaningful body of evidence, both in terms of the number of formal responses and the wider feedback that we've gathered through the breadth of engagement across the district. In terms of where those responses are focused, while concerns have been raised across most aspects of the plan, the intensity of objection is clearly concentrated on a relatively small number of the site-specific proposals. In particular, members will be aware from the report that a significant proportion of the representations relate to the proposed allocation of Brightlingsea, the sites around Kirby Cross and Walton, and the proposed garden villages at Hare Green and Horsley Cross. And what that tells us is that whilst there is a broad level of concern about growth across the district, there are a relatively small number of proposals where that concern is particularly acute and locally focused. And in many cases, that reflects very specific local circumstances at those sites, rather than a uniform concern across the whole plan. As Gary's already explained, the themes coming through those responses are broadly consistent and unsurprising, focusing on things such as infrastructure capacity, environmental impacts, and the overall scale and distribution of growth. There are also concerns around affordability of new housing, who the new housing will benefit, as well as questions around how housing growth will be matched by jobs and economic opportunities across the district, all of which are clearly important issues for our local communities. But one point that's important to re-emphasise, particularly in the context of the number of objections to certain sites, is that in planning terms, it's not the volume of representations that determine whether the plan is sound. What matters is the nature of the issues raised and whether those issues can be properly addressed through evidence, policy and mitigation. And that's ultimately what the plan will be tested against at examination. Now, Gary's touched on the importance of the responses from our statutory consultees and technical bodies, and from a planning perspective, these are particularly important. And the report goes into some detail about these responses, and the full correspondence from each of the technical stakeholders are attached as appendices. But for a brief overview, members will see that key technical stakeholders are raising quite specific and really helpful points. So, for example, Essex County Council are broadly supportive of the strategy, but have raised important issues around infrastructure, particularly transport and education capacity, including a clear concern about school provision at Thorpe-le-Soken. National Highways are also supportive in principle, but have taken a holding position on the garden villages, pending the outcome of the next phase of the transport modelling work. Natural England are generally supportive of the environmental approach, but have highlighted the need for further work on the habitat regulations assessment and the importance of issues such as functionally linked land. And work on the Habitats Regulation Assessment, or the HRA, is something that is already underway and will be reported to the committee in much more depth when we bring the next draft of the local plan before you. The Environment Agency are supportive, but have emphasised flood risk and water infrastructure, as well as the need to update and further iterate our strategic flood risk assessment. Anglian Water supports the overall approach, but have highlighted some specific constraints around sewage infrastructure, particularly in some of our smallest villages, as well as in relation to the garden villages. The NHS and health partners have emphasised the need for flexibility in how healthcare is provided and funded as the population grows. Historic England have recommended further work on a heritage impact assessment to ensure that the impacts on heritage assets across the plan are fully understood, and that's work that is already underway and is being prepared over the coming months as we continue to progress with the local plan. And organisations such as Essex Wildlife Trust have provided helpful ecological advice, including raising a specific objection in relation to the proposed allocation in Walton. The overall tone of those responses has been consistently supportive and constructive, and importantly, there's nothing at all to suggest that the plan is fundamentally unsound in principle. But those responses do clearly identify areas where further work is needed to ensure the plan is robust, and importantly, those are the areas that will ultimately determine whether the plan meets the tests of soundness and examination. Now, there are three really important implications coming out of those representations. In particular, work such as the next phase of transport modelling and the further work on the Habitats Regulations Assessment will be crucial in allowing us to reach firm conclusions on some of the more significant proposals, especially the larger strategic sites, where issues such as infrastructure capacity, environmental impact, and long-term delivery need to be fully tested. And that includes the position of Essex County Council and National Highways in relation to the garden villages, where further work is needed before a clear view can be taken. And there are a number of site-specific issues that also need to be addressed. Technical consultees have raised specific matters in relation to individual locations, such as ecological considerations at Walton on the Naze, infrastructure capacity issues, and the education provision around Thorpe Le Soken. And these responses aren't unexpected, but they're the kinds of issues that require careful adjustment to policies or to allocations as the plan progresses. And perhaps most importantly to take away is that there is nothing that's irresolvable. At this stage, there's nothing coming through in the technical consultees that suggests the issues can't be addressed. Rather, they point us towards a careful and proportionate work that now needs to be done to strengthen the plan and ensure that it meets the test of soundness. And just very briefly, alongside the views of residents and communities, we've also received representations from landowners, developers and agents, often making very different and opposing arguments to each other. And that's normal as part of the local plan process, and it reflects the fact that as we move forward, the council will be weighing up competing perspectives and evidence in reaching that balanced and robust position. So what this gives us isn't just a summary of concerns, but a clear evidence base to inform the next stage of the local plan. The consultation responses point quite clearly towards a set of key matters that now need to be addressed as we move forward. And broadly, those relate to the delivery of some of the largest proposals in the plan, the distribution and scale of housing growth, the soundness of specific site allocations, and the need to ensure that the evidence base is complete and robust. And particularly, members will note that a number of those matters go directly to the question of deliverability, both in terms of individual sites and the overall housing requirement. And that's what the next report on this evening's agenda moves on to, is how officers are beginning to respond to those issues and what changes may be appropriate as we prepare for the next version of the plan. And as Gary has spoken about and has been discussed in questions, this also sits alongside the very real short-term risks around housing land supply and exposure to speculative development, which makes progressing to the next stage of the local plan all the more important. The recommendation for this report is set out on page 32 of your agenda. And it recommends that the committee notes the contents of the report, which provides a broad overview based on initial analysis of some of the main matters and issues raised by residents and other stakeholders in response to the public consultation on Regulation 18 of the Tendring District Local Plan, Preferred Options Draft and associated evidence base. That the committee acknowledges in particular the significant level of public objection to proposals and policies relating to additional housing and mixed-use developments that have needed to be included in the draft local plan to meet the government's new mandatory house building targets. Notes that officers are in the process of considering all the representations in detail, with the intention of producing a report containing responses to all the comments that will form part of the evidence base published alongside the revised version of the Regulation 19 submission version of the draft local plan. And notes that the next separate report sets out officers' emerging thoughts on potential next steps for the local plan, including provisional recommendations for changes to the draft plan and additional work to strengthen the technical evidence base. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul, for your presentation. Members, any question for Paul? Councillor Chapman.
I know I'm going to leave for the next item anyway, but I will come back for the following one. I just really want to place on record that it's an excellent report again, and to thank both Gary and Paul for the amount of time they've spent with Councillor Steady and myself particularly, going over the other sites. And I can even tell you Gary spent a day off visiting Brightling Sea before he went to the beach to visit the sites that we've been talking about. But I just really want to place it on record that thank you very much. You've gone beyond the call of duty and spent an awful lot of time with us. So thank you.
I don't think there was a question there.
No question, sorry.
Okay, before we go to the, I've got no further speakers. Before we go to the recommendation, just like to put on record that both Councillor Baker and I, because the Lawford Tie Action Group has been mentioned, we are members of that, and I'm also sitting on the Parish Council. Lawford to put forward the representation, but that's all part of the consultation process, I would imagine. Yeah. Thank you.
Just to confirm, Chairman, former member of Lawford Tie Action Group, and obviously was involved in the appeal process for the field. Thank you.
Small, Keith. Someone will come and get you. Yeah. Okay, so the next item is agenda item 7A2, report to the Corporate Director of Planning Community, Tendring District Local Plan Review, emerging thoughts and provision recommendation for the next step. This is on page
Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'd like to address the recommendation to delete sites MSA 19, the proposal for 12 new homes on Manningtree Road in Little Bentley, and MSA 20, the proposal for 17 new homes on Shop Road in Little Bromley. The report suggests removing these sites from the plan due to comments from Anglian Water. However, the letter from Anglian Water appears to have been misunderstood. Their concern relates only to a scenario in which the new homes would connect to the existing public sewer. That was never the intention. As with these many rural villages, homes in Little Bentley and Little Bromley rely on private sewer drainage. This development would follow exactly the same approach. In other words, the basis for deletion simply does not apply to these sites. Beyond this point of clarification, there are strong planning reasons to retain the Little Bentley and Little Bromley sites. First, the sites support the council's wider housing strategy. To meet housing targets sustainably, the plan needs a balanced mix of small, medium and large sites. These 12 and 17 homes would make a meaningful contribution, particularly at a time when the council is proposing to reduce its contingency supply of housing. It would make the local plan more robust. Second, these are highly deliverable sites. Schemes of this scale are attractive to small and medium-sized builders, precisely the type of developers who can bring forward homes quickly and diversify the local housing market. Third, villages like Little Bentley and Little Bromley rely on modest, well-planned growth. These homes will provide opportunities for young people who want to stay close to where they grew up, and for older residents looking to downsize while remaining part of their community. Without this gentle, organic growth, rural villages risk decline, both in their built fabric and in their community life. To conclude, I respectfully ask members not to delete these two sites. The Anglian Water comments do not apply to drainage solution proposed here, and there are clear strategic, deliverability and community-focused reasons to retain both Little Bentley and Little Bromley within the local plan. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bird. If you'd like to go back to your gallery. Paul, can I ask if you're going to pick up the comments from the speakers in your presentation, both the previous and this current one? Yep, okay. So over to you. Who would like to? No, Ms. Taylor, you've spoken. You don't need to speak on this item again. Your first presentation, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you. So report A2. So from my experience of working at this council and with other councils on local plans over many years, it would not be unusual nor unexpected for it to take best part of a year from the end of a preferred option stage consultation to analyse all the representations, update the evidence and come back to councillors with recommendations for a revised version of the plan. But this time round we don't have a year because the planning system is in transition and we need to update the evidence, revise the local plan, carry out another round of consultation and submit the plan to the Secretary of State all before the end of December this year, or else we're caught by the cut-off date for moving to the new system and would have to start the whole process again. Our neighbours in Colchester and Braintree are in exactly the same boat and we are working to similarly tight time frames. As colleagues and I have described in previous meetings and reports, the consequence of delay is also an extension of the time in which our district would remain vulnerable to speculative planning applications for housing development. And as well as last week's appeal decision that I mentioned just earlier, members will note from this report that we are currently in receipt of a growing number of other planning applications for housing development, including in some locations such as Elmstead Market and larger development in strategic green gaps off Sladbury's Lane, areas that we have been looking to protect. Now, we can't prejudge the decisions that will be taken on those planning applications, but it's clearly become more important than ever before to progress the work of the local plan quickly. And to assist with this, we are not holding back from bringing forward our early thoughts as officers on potential next steps, provisional recommendations for changes to the site allocations in the plan, and the work needed to strengthen the technical evidence base, informed, of course, by the comments we received in response to the consultation which we've just discussed. Bringing these recommendations forward early serves two main purposes. Firstly, it enables us to be transparent and let the public know what we're thinking of doing, so that they know that the council is taking their comments seriously and that we are prepared to make changes, albeit doing so properly appraised of the potential risks and consequences. And secondly, bringing some provisional recommendations forward early allows us to sense check the direction of travel and ensure that there are no surprises and that councillors are broadly comfortable with the approach. This way we can crack on with updating the technical evidence base. We can finish off the detailed task of reviewing and revisiting the policies in the local plan, knowing the broad direction that we are looking to head in. Without this interim sense check and the direction and guidance from our elected councillors, we risk potentially abortive work and leaving ourselves too little time in the coming weeks and months to progress to the next critical stage of the process in what is becoming an ever tighter programme. The recommendations in this report focus on 4 things essentially. First is the proposed update to the period of time that the local plan will cover, so that it runs from 2026, i.e. the year that we're in now, to 2043, which will meet the minimum expectation that local plans run 15 years from the anticipated point of adoption. And in doing so, will also be in alignment with our colleagues and neighbours in Colchester and Braintree. Second is an update to the housing target for that 2026 to 2043 period, in line with the very latest calculation carried out using the government standard methodology, which in the big scheme of things results in a relatively minor increase from what was previously 18,071 homes over 17 years to 18,173. The third area is our provisional recommendations for changes to the housing and mixed-use allocations in the local plan, which include, amongst others, the deletion of 2 of the most objected to developments in the plan at Brightlingsea and Walton, adjustments to the proposed housing numbers on certain sites, and a small number of new sites proposed for inclusion, the overall effect of which will be a significant net reduction in the total potential supply of housing land in the draft local plan, still above the government's target requirement, but with a significantly reduced level of headroom contingency, which carries some risk, which I'll touch on later. Fourthly, elements of the technical evidence base do need to be updated, or at least developed further before the council can take a final decision on the local plan that gets published for further consultation and is submitted to the Secretary of State, and much of this work is underway. So you will see that the 10 main matters identified in the initial analysis of the consultation responses that were in report A1 are replicated in this report with an explanation of officers' thoughts on how we could proceed. And before I ask Paul in a moment to go into the detail, I'd just like to give a few comments on these main issues and matters. Matter 1 is the realistic deliverability and soundness of the garden villages at Hare Green and Horsley Cross, which we always knew were the most radical element of the plan, and which, if determined to be feasible, would still take a number of years to plan before any development actually started and took place. And as been mentioned before, our colleagues in Essex County Council and at National Highways have reserved judgment on the deliverability and soundness of the proposals from a transport perspective, pending the results of the next phase of transport modelling. And so this council's final judgment on whether they should remain in the local plan, and by implication whether the district can realistically achieve the government's housing targets, will have to wait for now. That transport modelling work is underway, but even if the garden villages do remain in the plan, we are suggesting that we revise down the assumptions for how many new homes can be built in Hare Green and Horsley Cross, and that forms one of the recommendations in the report, to allow more time for them to come forward. Now, the knock-on effect of this and the number of site deletions recommended in this report could have a bearing in respect of matter 2, which is the deliverability of the overall house building target, because we would be cutting the amount of over-allocation and contingency, or buffer as it's sometimes called, to allow for these changes. In response to matters 3, 4 and 5 in the report, we are proposing the deletion of some significant housing sites from the plan at Brightlingsea, at Walton and at Thorpe, which, if agreed, will likely address or at least ease the concerns raised by quite a large proportion of the public in their objections to the local plan. So you might say to me, well what's the catch? Well, the catch is that with a much lower level of headroom contingency or buffer built into the overall numbers, we will get objections from landowners, developers and planning agents, not only for the sites that we're proposing to delete from the plan and other sites that weren't in the plan in the first place, arguing that the margins are too fine, And we're increasing the risk of the government target not being achieved. And they will argue that we would need to include more, not fewer, sites in the plan for development. Now, I suspect this is an argument that will be run not only through the local plan review process, but one that will probably be rehearsed in planning appeals over the coming months as well. But under the circumstances, officers believe the deletions and overall reduction in the size of the buffer is justified. But we know it will be challenged and criticised. Under matter 6, there are understandably questions about the sustainability of having residential developments, even small ones, of between 10 and 30 homes in and around some of the district's smaller rural villages, which have less in the way of services and facilities. In places like Little Bentley, Little Bromley, Tendring, Beaumont and Rabness, we have in the past been very strict in not having much residential development in those locations on grounds of sustainability and minimising the need to travel. But of course we are dealing with a much higher house building target now, and there are benefits of having smaller developments in different locations of the district, including some of the rural areas. And actually Mr. Vogt in his statement earlier did allude to some of those benefits that can be had from having developments, small developments in rural areas. Now councillors will note that we still propose having some of these developments in the local plan in and around smaller villages, but there was advice from Anglian Water, and the advice in their representations has led us to consider whether the proposals for Little Bentley, Little Bromley and Tendring Heath are appropriate if they cannot connect to mains sewage. Mr. Vogt has requested that we reconsider that position, and if members want to discuss that in more detail, officers would be very happy to advise, and we can do so referring to what our policies are on sewage treatment and connection to different types of sewage works. Under matters 8 and 9, we have been challenged by landowners, developers and planning agents to justify our principal approach of maintaining, protecting and expanding strategic green gaps, and the protection being given to Ardleigh and Elmstead Market given their unique situation. The argument is that certainly green gap sites and sites around Ardleigh and particularly Elmstead Market, the argument from those objectors is that those locations could offer sustainable locations for development, reduce our reliance on the radical proposals for the garden villages at Hare Green and Horsley Cross, and could reduce the risk of us falling short of the government housing targets. We will be interested in councillors' thoughts on this subject as part of the discussion, but as it stands, officers are recommending that we continue to protect the green gaps, that we continue to protect Ardleigh and Elmstead, and that we build upon and strengthen our evidence and justification going forward, knowing again that we will come under strong challenge. We know we lost an appeal last week for 30 homes in a green gap, and we have a 350 home planning application in for a larger area of land of Slabberys Lane, which will need to be determined on its merits in due course. But we also have 3 major planning applications for Elmstead Market at the moment, totalling 276 homes, some of which are in the proposed green gap. The pressure on those areas is certainly building. But officers hold the view that the protections are justified, particularly given that there are up-to-date neighbourhood plans for Ardleigh and for Elmstead. Both areas are affected by the garden community, the Tendring Colchester Borders garden community, and there is a significant amount of development still in the pipeline for Elmstead Market that has yet to come forward. Now, matters 9 and 10 relate to viability and the need to update and build upon certain elements of the evidence base. Now, we are addressing these issues by reviewing the viability evidence and all the other parts of the evidence that we know will need to be revisited and updated as we progress to the next stage of the process. But For this meeting, we won't be going into the detail of potential policy changes. That will be something that we will be picking up when we bring the plan forward at a future meeting. We're focusing mainly on sites as part of this meeting. And with your blessing, Chairman, I will hand over to Paul, who can go through the detail of the amended housing numbers, the proposed changes to the sites, and the recommendations with reference to the update sheet, which I know we've already alluded to earlier on in the meeting.
I will go straight to Paul and we'll pick up questions altogether at the end. Members, okay? Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Chairman. I will start with the proposed update to the plan period because this underpins everything else. Members are aware that we're proposing now that the local plan should run from 2026 through to 2043. And the reason for that is that once the plan is submitted later this year, we need to allow 12 months for examination, which is likely to take us through the whole of 2027. And then the plan period should run 15 years from the following April, from when we anticipate adopting the local plan. So that would be the period April 2028 through until March 2043, the 15 years that national policy requires us to plan for. So it's not an arbitrary extension, it's about ensuring that the plan remains compliant with national policy and is robust at examination. So turning then to the housing requirement, members have been informed that the housing target has changed slightly since the preferred options consultation, and it's worth briefly explaining why that is. The full calculation is set out on page 393 of your agenda, but essentially the government standard method for calculating housing need is based on two key inputs: national population and household projections and local affordability data. And both of those inputs to the calculation are updated annually, and so the resulting housing requirement can change from year to year. What we've done is use the latest available inputs from 2026, and that results in a small increase in the overall requirement. And so the housing requirement for the submission version of the local plan that we will bring back to members later in the year will need to deliver 1,069 homes per year. And importantly, once the local plan is submitted for examination, that figure effectively becomes fixed for the purposes of the examination. So while the change itself is relatively modest, an increase in 6 homes a year from earlier this year, it reflects the need to ensure that we are using the most up-to-date and robust figure available. And this should represent the final adjustment to the housing target that takes place during the local plan review. Before going into individual site changes that officers are provisionally proposing as part of this report, it's important just to reiterate the overall position that the local plan still meets the government housing target and still includes a level of additional supply, what we refer to as the buffer or the contingency. But as a result of the changes being proposed, that supply reduces and therefore the headroom reduces quite significantly. So we're moving from a position of greater flexibility to one where the margin for error is tighter and the delivery of sites becomes much more critical. So I'll take members through the proposed changes settlement by settlement, and it should align with the plans that I'm going to show on the screen, but which are also available in your agenda packs as an appendix as well. And so starting with Brightlingsea, members will recall that the preferred options plan included a single large allocation on the edge of the town. It attracted a very high level of objection. Now, since that stage, earlier this year, officers have been working closely with Brightlingsea Town Council. They've been particularly proactive in helping to shape an alternative approach. And so that work has led to a revised strategy for the town, which removes the larger, more prominent allocation to the north and replaces it with a number of smaller sites which are better related to the existing built-up area and more consistent with the character of the town. So there's the potential for 60 homes proposed at the Well House site, that's MSA 33, which is a brownfield land that was previously a site of a care home that's now been demolished. Land at Panel Place, which increases from the 10 dwellings we proposed earlier this year to 20 in accordance with information from the developer, and a proposal for 25 homes north of Robinson Road, MSA 35. and a new site, MSA 34, for 30 homes to the northwest of the town, and the retention of the existing MSA 5 proposal at the old telephone exchange for 15 homes. This brings the total number of new homes in Brightlingsea down from 325 to 150, so a reduction in 175 homes. But importantly, this isn't about stopping growth in Brightlingsea altogether. The revised approach still delivers a number of homes that sits within the range previously identified through the agreed spatial strategy, and therefore it continues to contribute appropriately towards meeting the district's overall housing requirement. So what this represents isn't simply a response to an objection, but it's a more refined and locally informed distribution of development, which officers consider is better aligned with both the evidence and local circumstances in Brightlingsea. Turning then to Frinton, Walton and Kirby Cross. In planning terms, these are treated as a single settlement in our local plan settlement hierarchy, but recognising that each of them has its own distinct character and community. The key proposed change here is the removal of the allocation at Walton. That allocation attracted a significant level of objection through public consultation, but the key driving factor to recommend removing the site is the representation from Essex Wildlife Trust, who raised significant concerns in relation to ecology, and in particular the role of the site as functionally linked land, which in simple terms is land that may sit outside of a designated habitat but still supports the wildlife of nearby protected sites. This is a material planning consideration of considerable weight, and one that would present a clear risk to the soundness of the plan if not properly addressed. And so on that basis, officers consider that the Walton allocation shouldn't be taken forward. That's SAH 3 for 200 homes. Alongside removing that site, there's also a modest increase in the number of homes at Kirby Cross based on updated information provided by the site promoter and further work on the site's capacity. And when taken together, the overall effect across this combined settlement is a net reduction of 170 homes being proposed in Frinton, Walton and Kirby Cross, down from 660 to 490 homes across the planned period, which also goes some way towards addressing the concerns raised about the overall scale of development in this part of the district. And then just briefly on to Kirby Lassoken. Here the change is much more limited, but involves removing the proposed site to the northwest of the village, MSA 18, reflecting more detailed site assessment work and discussions with highways colleagues at Essex County Council. And so, whilst relatively modest in scale, this is part of the same overall process of fine-tuning the plan to ensure that all of the sites that are taken forward are appropriate and deliverable. Turning to Thorpe Lassoken, here the key issues raised through consultation, particularly by Essex County Council as the education authority, relates to primary school capacity. And in simple terms, the position is as follows. The original scale of development proposed would generate pupil numbers beyond the capacity of the existing primary school. The school itself, Rolf, can't be expanded. But at the same time, the level of housing being proposed in the draft local plan isn't sufficient to justify the delivery of a new standalone primary school in the village. So that creates a mismatch between the scale of development and the ability of the village to support the necessary infrastructure. And so officers have worked closely with our colleagues at Essex County Council to explore the options. And in practical terms, there are two. Either the level of development is increased significantly to justify a new school, which isn't considered appropriate for Thorpe in planning terms, or the development in the village is reduced to a level that can be accommodated within the existing primary school. And so the proposed approach reflects that second option, and we're recommending the removal of SAH 10 to the west of the village, as well as a reduction in the scale of development at SAH 11, which reflects the most up-to-date information from the land promoters and planning applications and discussions that we have been having with the landowners there. It's a good illustration of how getting the scale of development right is just as important as identifying the sites themselves. And it's a good example of the plan being directly shaped by infrastructure constraints and adjusted to ensure that development remains both deliverable and sustainable. Now, if we move across to Bradfield, here the proposed changes reflect discussions with the parish council and the views expressed by a number of local residents of how development could best relate to the existing settlement. And so rather than a single larger allocation of 100 homes to the west of the village, officers are now suggesting an approach that looks at smaller scale development, potentially across more than one site, which would allow development to be more closely integrated within the existing village form. It's intended to address concerns about the scale and relationship of development to the village and the need to ensure that growth remains proportionate and sympathetic to local character. And so the provisional recommendation is to reduce MSA 9 from 100 homes to 20 and reduce the size of that site significantly to about a third. And then to add 2 new sites to the east of the village, land north of Wicks Road for 25 homes and a site south of the playing field for 30 homes. So again, it's less about removing growth altogether and more about refining how that growth is distributed in a very specific part of the district. Now, in Beaumont, officers are proposing a reduction in the number of homes in response to latest information from site promoters. Now, the single site to the west of the village remains the same physical size, but we're proposing to reduce it from 20 to 12 new homes, which will much more closely reflect the existing density and the character of the village, and go some way to address the significant concerns raised by that community about the scale of growth being proposed. And in Mistley, site MSA 4, which is at the Crisp Maltings, is now being proposed for 50 homes rather than 80, based on most recent information provided by the site promoter there about the site's capacity. And so now turning to the smaller villages that were the focus of Mr. Vote's representation this evening, and in particular the sites at Little Bentley, Little Bromley, as well as Tendring Heath. And the issues here arise from representations from Anglian Water, and their advice is that the locations don't have access to the main sewer network, and that connection to the network will not be feasible within a reasonable time frame. And in practice, that means that development in these locations would be reliant on alternative drainage and sewerage provision, rather than connecting to a public sewer system. So from a planning perspective, that does raise questions about long-term sustainability of the development, the reliability and management of private systems, and the deliverability of sites over the lifetime of the plan. Acknowledging, of course, that there are examples in those villages of sites that have been successfully delivered with those alternative provisions. But it's important to be clear that the recommendation is based on the evidence currently available and reflects a judgment about risk and uncertainty, rather than a definitive conclusion that development in these locations isn't possible. We're aware that in some cases developers have indicated that there's an alternative solution available, and those are matters that can be explored further. But based on the information currently available, officers consider that it's appropriate to take a cautious and evidence-led position at this stage to avoid building in sites where there remains a degree of uncertainty around infrastructure provision. And so at Little Bentley, the site to the west is being removed. Little Bromley, the site to the south. And at Tendring Heath, the site on the old haulage yard. And so these are the provisional recommendations for those sites that are put forward in the report. Now, members should also be aware of an additional change set out in the update sheet relating to the site at Wicks at Abbey Bottom Farm. Officers have received new and material information regarding land ownership which significantly affects the site. And in particular, that site, which is MSA 27 to the east of the village, is now in multiple ownership, and a significant proportion, about 40% of the land, is under control of a third party who have confirmed they don't intend to bring the land forward for development. And so now there are physical and ownership constraints that affect access to the remainder of the site and the ability to plan that site comprehensively. And so from a planning perspective, that raises a significant question around deliverability. In this case, the change in ownership introduces uncertainty around whether the site can realistically be brought forward, whether a suitable access can be achieved, and whether a coherent and viable scheme could actually be delivered. And so On the basis, officers' view is that there is now a high degree of uncertainty which goes directly to the soundness in relation to this allocation. And unlike some of the examples members have heard this evening, this isn't about refinement or mitigation. It's just a question of whether this site is deliverable at all in its current form. And so on a provisional basis, officers are recommending that that particular site is removed in the next draft of the local plan, and consequential adjustments are made to the overall housing numbers that are reflected in the report. And so just before moving on to the overall position, it's important to address the position in relation to the garden villages at Horsley Cross and at Hare Green. As Gary set out, a final judgment on their deliverability and soundness can't be made until the next phase of transport modelling and infrastructure work is complete. However, what we are able to do at this stage is take a more realistic view of their likely contribution of homes within the plan period. In the preferred options plan, each garden village was assumed to deliver around 1,700 homes within the plan period. But officers are now proposing that this is reduced to around 1,450 homes in each location, with the first homes not now being expected to be delivered until 2033-34. This reflects the reality that these are large and complex developments. They require significant upfront planning, master planning and infrastructure investment, and that they'll take time to come forward in a coordinated and deliverable way. And so it's not a change in the principle, it's just a change in the timing to ensure that the plan is based on a realistic and defendable trajectory. And importantly, the long-term scale of development of both garden villages remains unchanged. So while fewer homes might come forward during the plan period, they're still expected to play a significant role in meeting the housing needs over the longer term beyond 2043. Taking all of those changes together, it's important to step back and look at the overall position of the plan in numerical terms. The overall housing requirement for the plan period is 18,173 homes. And at the preferred option stage, the total supply identified in the plan was around 19,500, which provided a buffer of around 1,500 homes above the requirement. So as a result of the changes that we've just walked through, including the removal of the sites at Brightlingsea, Walton, Thorpe and Wicks, the adjustment to the smaller village sites and the revised assumption around the garden villages, the total potential supply is now expected to be around 18,400 homes. It includes an update to the pipeline supply as well, which is sites that are either allocated in the adopted local plan or sites that benefit from planning permission already. And it reflects the most up-to-date position, with the exception of the latest appeal decision, which is set out on your update sheet, with regards to sites with planning permission that have been granted over the last 12 months. This will be kept under review and it will be updated fully to reflect the most up-to-date SHLA document, which will be an accompanying document to the final draft of the local plan later this year. So what that does mean is that the remaining headroom in the local plan reduces to around 250 to 300 homes. It means we're still meeting the government's requirement, and that's the critical starting point, but we're doing so with a much tighter margin than before. And so there are some important implications for that Gary has alluded to. There's now much less flexibility in the plan, and we're more dependent on the delivery of the sites that remain. We're likely to face strong challenge from landowners and developers, arguing that the plan doesn't include a sufficient buffer, and the delivery of each individual site becomes much more important because there's less capacity to absorb delays and underperformance. And so members are being asked to consider here is the trade-off between having a large buffer of sites that are being objected to by some technical consultees with very compelling planning reasons that they shouldn't be included, or having a smaller buffer but with a much more robust strategy that is defendable at examination. Officers' view is that what we've proposed in the report and through the update sheet is a reasoned and balanced approach, given the scale of the government's housing requirement and also the strength and nature of the issues raised through consultation. And finally, just to briefly touch on the position in relation to the evidence base, which underpins all of the proposed changes. A number of key studies are well underway and are being updated and iterated following the preferred options draft of the plan. These studies are well advanced and in the process of being updated, including the next phase of transport modelling, updates to the habitats regulations assessments, the infrastructure delivery plan, which takes a holistic view of the infrastructure requirements across the whole of the plan period, flood risk work, and the viability assessment, as well as the sustainability appraisal, which is the document that underpins our strategy as far as the local plan is concerned. They're not just background studies, but they're central to some of the key issues that members have heard about this evening. Officers are confident that the necessary work will be completed to inform the submission version of the plan, which will be brought back to the committee later this year. However, it's important to recognise that this is an iterative process, and if any of the evidence identifies issues that require further adjustment to the plan, then those will need to be considered at the appropriate stage. It's also important to recognise what the report this evening doesn't do, because we've spoken a lot about different sites that may or may not be appropriate to carry forward, but we haven't spoken about detailed changes to policy wording, but also other designations and protections that the local plan can offer. So thinking back to the comments raised by Mrs. Taylor at the start of the meeting, we're aware of the representations that have been received by the town and parish councils affected by the Lawford Tye development and the Lawford Tye site, and we're considering very seriously what additional protection the local plan may be able to offer that site. And it's important to acknowledge that the issues that Mrs. Taylor raised, particularly around heritage, the Scheduled 8 Nature Monument, landscape quality and biodiversity, each of those issues offer the site significant levels of protection in and of themselves. And so what we'll be looking at in the next draft of the local plan is what additional protection beyond those existing constraints that exist at the site the local plan may be able to support. And so, taking all of that together, the report represents an initial evidence-led response to what we've heard through the consultation and from our technical consultees. It sets out a potential direction of travel which responds to the concerns raised by residents and communities, reflects the input of town and parish councils, takes account of the technical and infrastructure constraints, and still seeks to meet the government's mandatory housing target. It's much more finely balanced, with less flexibility than before. But it's important to emphasise that these are provisional recommendations intended to provide a working basis for the next stage of preparing the local plan. They're not final decisions on site allocations that members are being asked to make tonight. They will come forward later this year as part of the submission version of the local plan. And so the recommendations, as they are written in the report, are set out on page 378. And it's recommended that the Planning Policy and Local Plan Committee, having previously considered report A1, containing an initial overview of the response to public consultation on the local plan preferred options draft, notes the contents of the report, which sets out officers' emerging thoughts on potential next steps, including provisional recommendations for changes to sites and further work to strengthen the technical evidence base. Acknowledges and agrees that the updated mandatory housing target for tendering, calculated using the government standard methodology, increases to 1,069 homes a year, giving a total requirement for the rolled forward 17-year period, 1st of April 2026 to 31st of March 2043, of 18,173. Approves the officer's provisional recommendations for potential changes to the site proposals in the draft local plan, as set out in this report and depicted on maps at Appendix 1, which are intended to form a working basis for further evidence-based work and preparation of the submission version, rather than representing final decisions on site allocations. Notes that if the provisional changes set out in this report were to be taken forward, the potential supply of homes from proposals in a revised local plan, alongside development that's already in the pipeline, would be expected to total approximately 18,432, which would still exceed the mandatory housing requirement of 18,173 by 259 homes, albeit with a much reduced level of oversupply and contingency from that indicated in the preferred options draft. Agrees that the provisional approach to the site changes, together with any amendments arising from the committee's consideration, be used as a working basis for progressing the preparation of the submission version of the local plan and associated evidence base, with the full draft plan, including updated policies and maps, to be brought to the Planning Policy and Local Plan Committee for further consideration in late summer 2026, ahead of any decision to proceed to the next stage of public consultation. And notes that subject to the committee's resolution in respect of E above, officers will progress updates to the sustainability appraisal, habitats regulations assessment, transport modelling, infrastructure delivery plan and other relevant evidence-based documents in order to test and inform the development of the submission version of the local plan. Thank you, Chairman.
And you didn't stop to catch breath at all in the presentation. Well done, Paul. Before I go to members, I just really wanted to clarify some of the comments that both you made about the small sites in tendering Little Bromley and Little Bentley. I'm pretty certain that Anglia Water, most of the houses are not provided by Anglia Water for the sewage connection, and that most of the houses there rely on their own private waste disposal facilities, cesspit and whatnot. Is that the case? Am I right in thinking that?
Yes, Chairman. No, that's correct. That the majority, if not all, of the homes in those villages they don't have main sewage connections.
Because the point that follows that is that each of those villages have got a new one main business in each location. There's 2 shops and 1 pub, which are the only existing business in there in the community, where moderate or delivery of houses would help to support from the economic front. And I think the point that Mr. Vogt made was that they're deliverable sites, which are ready to go really. And although it's an additional 30, only make a contribution of 30 houses in total, would be 30 houses more and increase our buffer by a little bit more. But I'm sure that that'll be picked up in the discussion. Obviously, I'm interested in your comments about Ms. Taylor's speech on Robert Tye, and so we'll look forward for that to evolve as we progress with the local plan. Members, over to you, Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Woods and Gary, very good report on this. A few things I want to ask. The reduction of houses in Brightonsea is going to be welcomed by a lot of people in Brightonsea town, councillors, district councillors. But on the new locations, has there been any consideration on the highway improvements? I mean, you've got MSA 6, 20 homes to the right of Whitegate Estate, and that's quite chocker around there in terms of Hurst Green, Chapel Road. There's a lot of vehicles going there and a lot of parking, so it'd be interesting about that. In terms of MSA 33, that's on the old Well House site. I know the site very well. That's on the Manor Estate, and a lot of vehicles go through there now. So, what highway provision there? On the corner of Romston Road and Chapel Lane, MSA 35, 25 homes. That area, I would say you probably need some significant improvement in highways. And finally, on MSA 34, 30 homes on the edge of Brightsea, Church Road, going towards the junction of Forge, the old Forge on Sampson's Road there. All these sites are going to lead down to the main road in and out of Brightsea, and that is quite chocker at best of time. And leading out of Brightsea into Thorrington Cross, the traffic there is backed up in all directions, going towards Bentley, Alsford, going towards St Osiph and Thorrington. So I'd be interested to know that. I know you reduced it from 325 to 150, 175 reduction. But I think the emphasis of highway improvements in those locations are needed. In terms of the health, I've seen the comments from the local surgery. There must be significant improvements in the health, because I know that Cone surgeries are linked to the other surgeries in the surrounding communities, and they are full now. And finally, in terms of the school provisions, and I know schools in that area are full. Bring me on to another section of the community, the garden communities of Hare Green, Freighting area, reduction to 1,450. Is that between 2033 and 34, you're saying? If that's the case, significant improvements, the highway improvements to Elmstead, to Bromley areas, because they're not big roads, they are small roads leading from community to community, especially from Elmstead to Hare Green. So vast improvements are needed along that stretch, and then going on to the A120 freighting area. We all know that traffic piles up along there. If you're going past Little Bentley freighting and the turn-offs to Great Bentley, some improvements are needed urgently along there and going on to the A120. So I'd be interested to know your comments, Mr. Woods. Thank you.
I believe there's a transport assessment that's due to come, which will probably pick all those points up. But I think you've got about 6 questions there, Gary. You want to pick them up?
Thank you, Councillor Scott. Really helpful points to raise. So starting at the beginning, the sites in Brightlingsea. You're absolutely right that with the change in sites, there needs to be additional work to understand the impacts of those sites and the implications for infrastructure such as highways and others. And there is a distinction to be made between the local impacts, so a particular site on a particular busy road, as well as access that's needed there, and the larger, more strategic impacts that you've identified, such as the traffic leaving Brightlingsea and going through Thorrington Cross. On these smaller, more local impacts, these sites are being proposed as MSA sites, which in the local plan don't have their own site-specific policies setting out individual requirements, but are covered by the policies elsewhere in the local plan, particularly around safe access and infrastructure provision. And so, although Essex County Council, as the Highways Authority, are already aware of these sites and will be commenting on the local plan at the next stage of consultation, the specific details around those smaller sites and the access requirements aren't picked up in detail in policy here. They'll be raised through representations from the County Council, and they'll be raised further through planning applications when they come forward. And crucially, Essex County Council as the Highways Authority will be a consultee to those planning applications too. But looking at the bigger, more strategic work, and that's what is currently underway with Essex County Council Highways and their technical consultants. And you will remember at the last stage of consultation with the local plan, we had some initial reports from Jacobs looking at the highways and transport impacts of the local plan across the plan period. And that was a first iteration and a second iteration of the work, looking particularly at where the pressure points would be and also identifying where some of the sustainable transport mitigations would be. What is happening now as we speak is the next stage of that transport modelling work that looks at specific highways mitigations and interventions that will be required to support this level of growth. And so that will be looking very carefully at junctions like Thorrington Cross, also the impacts of the garden villages, which you spoke about. And I think Gary covered quite early in his presentation that the transport work around the garden villages is really going to be the pin on which everything hinges for those two large developments. We need to understand very clearly whether the impacts of that growth in those locations can or cannot be mitigated. And so I don't have firm answers about exactly what junction improvements may or may not be required, but could reassure you that that work is currently underway, it's well advanced, and it will inform whatever proposals we're able to bring back to the committee later this year. Education in Brightlingsea is also something that is considered very closely, and again, very fortunate to have a good relationship with our colleagues at Essex County Council. They already have sight of the recommendations that we've brought forward in the plan this evening and are running some modelling work. They call it a scenario test to understand what the capacity is currently in those schools, what it is likely to be in future. And crucially, they don't just look at the way things currently stand. They can look ahead quite easily 5 years because they know what birth rates have been, and so can look at how many children at 5 years old there will be in 5 years' time. But they also look at trends and understand whether birth rates are going up or going down, and that enables them to make an informed recommendation with regards to all the settlements in the local plan. And you'll see at Thorpe-le-Soken we've made the recommendation that the sites change based on that scenario test that Essex County Council have done. At Brightlingsea, they haven't raised any specific concerns that would lead us to remove a site, but there will need to be developer contributions towards upgrading or potentially expanding education provision in the town. Health and health provision is a bit of a trickier one, because the way the NHS works is there are lots of different organisations that often work in a bit of a siloed way. They talk to each other, and then ideally they will submit their representation to the council through the ICB. Sometimes we receive representations from individual bodies as well, and sometimes they don't always line up with each other. And so that makes it quite challenging to put in a robust plan for delivering infrastructure that meets not just the immediate needs at certain surgeries, but the larger, longer term aims and vision and strategy that the ICB has for healthcare in the area. And so suffice it to say at this stage that we are having quite in-depth conversations with the Integrated Care Board to understand the implications of growth across the district and all these different locations, to identify how we can align with their strategy for evolving models of healthcare provision, and make sure that's reflected in the infrastructure delivery plan, which will ensure that even for these smaller sites, where there is a cumulative impact on infrastructure such as health, developers will be expected to contribute towards meeting that additional need and mitigating the impacts. Now, I think that covers all of your points, Councillor Scott, but forgive me if I missed one in my notes there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Woods. Yes, you've come back and you answered the questions. In terms of Elmsted Market, no provision for future house building, and I know there's future applications coming in down the live at the moment. Do you know offhand if part of the transport statement is going to be improvements for the A133 going through to Elmsted to Freighting? Because if the Freighting one, Garden Community, going forward in the future, then there must be some vast improvements on the major road of the A133 through both communities. I was wondering if you can make a point on that, please.
We understand now, of course, with the ICB just being one across Essex, their focus are more on neighbourhood care. We learned a very good briefing this afternoon, and we look forward to see if that really is reality or not, if we're going to concentrate more on neighbourhood, which is exactly what we're trying to do. Councillor Everett.
Thank you, Chairman. I preface my question with the fact that I'm new to this committee, so I apologise if I ask anything that doesn't seem to, that has been covered before, and in which case I'm sure you'll correct me. The first thing is, all of this, you were discussing Braintree and Colchester working in parallel with us. Does LGR have any significance in terms of the way that we deal with the recommendations that we're making for the local plan? That's my first question. The second one is, I was fortunate enough to sit on the planning committee during the period of time that we're really talking about now for this local plan, but for the last local plan, which gives me a little bit of an insight maybe to some of the horrors that are potentially coming down the track for us. The presumption in favour of development really works on the process that if you haven't got a 5-year supply, I would paraphrase it, it means anything can be built anywhere. That's a very simplistic view, I would accept. However, does that affect the situation we have here with SAH4, SAH3, MSA18 and SAH10, in that if we take them out of the allocations, will developers be able to just go along on those same sites and put in planning applications which will be allowed at appeal? And so therefore, I suppose my question is there any point of taking them out? Finally, one question that was actually picked up by the chairman as well, drainage and sewerage. I ask, is that a realistic defence to take places out of the allocations? Because certainly the experience locally on drainage and sewerage is that there is a lot of other provision, alternative provision, and we have not been able to refuse planning applications on that basis. So if that's the case, with all of the ones that we've seen recently across the whole of the district, is there any point in taking those out of the allocation? And the final one is about Thorpe Lesoken, and particularly the infrastructure of highways infrastructure going through Thorpe Lesoken. Everything to the south and east of Thorpe Lesoken, the Frinton areas, Frinton and Walton that you were discussing, all the traffic, for tourism traffic and all local traffic, has to go through Thorpe Lesoken. Most people that know Thorpe Lesoken know it gets jammed now. So is there going to be some sort of provision coming from Essex County Council? I mean, in my heart, I'd love a bypass round Thorpe. That perhaps might be a little bit expensive. But we need to think about how we can deal with the extra traffic, particularly during the summer when it affects our tourism industry. Thank you.
Councillor Everett. Gary, do you want to take that? And Paul?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Everett. No, excellent questions. On the first one about what impact does LGR have, whether LGR happens or not, the statutory duty to produce a local plan still sits with the individual local authorities. And Colchester, Tendring and Braintree, yes, we've worked together before on strategic planning. This time round we have progressed individual local plans. That's okay, because if LGR happens, either these local plans will be progressed through examination and adopted as separate local plans, and the new unitary authority will effectively inherit the local plans as the statutory framework for determining planning applications. And it could be that they're referring to 3 local plans as and when applications come up in different parts of the wider unitary area. So LGR doesn't have a direct impact on the process that we're following at the moment. But going forward, for the next review of the local plan, if we have gone unitary at that point, then that unitary authority will have to make a decision as to whether it brings local plans forward in individual sections or brings them all together in one point. And of course, at that time, we may well have a spatial development strategy for the overall greater Essex area, which those future local plans will look back to and conform to going forward. On the presumption of sustainable development, and you know what happened a few years ago, and Councillor Everett, you and I sat together on a lot of those very difficult appeals. If we are deleting sites from the draft local plan, remembering it's draft, of course there is nothing to stop those landowners or developers from submitting a planning application and trying to make an argument around the council not being in the best position to demonstrate a 5-year supply. And the way that you set out how the presumption works is reasonably correct. Yes, if you don't have a 5-year supply, the presumption is in favour of housing development, unless other policies sort of indicate strongly otherwise. But I'd like to think that the reasons that we have given and the justification for recommending the removal of certain sites from the plan, and I'll talk about the drainage one in a second. For example, particularly if they relate to something like functionally linked land, where there's an ecological impact taken into consideration, you know, those are going to be planning factors that if somebody wanted to put in an application, you know, these are planning factors that may count against a development obtaining planning permission on the balance that's done. But the risk is true. You're absolutely right that somebody could submit a planning application site. We would need to deal with it on its merits in accordance with the tilted balance in the National Planning Policy Framework. But we've thought about that in making these recommendations on those sites tonight. But on the drainage and sewerage one, which you've understandably picked up because it's been mentioned a few times, You're right, Councillor Everett, that there are various cases across the district where we have granted consent for residential development, even though they wouldn't have a public sewer connection. Their sewage treatment requirements have been dealt with in an alternative manner, sewage package plants or communal facilities. There are ways of doing it. What we've done here is we've taken the Anglian Water suggestion that they'd be concerned about those kind of developments, and I don't disagree with Mr. Vote's interpretation of the Anglian Water representation at all, but we have, as Mr. Woods has said, we've taken the cautious approach that ideally you wouldn't want to go into a local plan examination knowing that Anglian Water have raised a concern about something. But on the same token, in responding direct to your question, does that place it as a risk that that kind of development could obtain planning permission? If it came in and had to be considered on its merits, bearing in mind the only reason we're suggesting taking them out is on sewerage, actually the policies do allow for a private approach. And actually I refer to policy PPL 5 of our emerging local plan. I know this is emerging policy. And it does say proposals for development must demonstrate that adequate provision exists or can be provided in time for sewage disposal to a public sewer and water recycling centre or sewage treatment works. But private sewage treatment facilities will not be permitted if there is an accessible public foul sewer. And that's a point that Anglian Water do raise a concern with in their representation. But where private sewage treatment facilities are the only practical option, and whether it's practical or not, that's going to be a matter of judgment. They will only be permitted where there would be no harm to the environment, having regard to preventing pollution of groundwater and any water courses and odour. So there is a route to obtaining planning permission in accordance with that policy that would be a consideration, for example, if those sites that we're proposing to delete on sewage grounds came back in as planning applications. But I think we do acknowledge the point that's been raised by Mr. Vote and the discussion, if members have alternative views about how we should treat those sites, we could look at that. But I suppose the justification for removing those particular sites on sewage grounds perhaps not as strong as the justification we have for some of the other sites that we are recommending removal of. On Thorpe and the highways infrastructure, absolutely, and this is one of the key issues that has come up, understandably, for a number of years, and in some of the public meetings we attended and some of the exhibitions that we manned, that Thorpe does suffer significantly as a result of general population growth, general increase in vehicular movements, the way that vehicles are parked in Thorpe High Street. Yet, from a technical transportation modelling perspective, actually some of the day-to-day issues that we witness and we experience locally through Thorpe don't necessarily show up as critical or severe highways problems, because a lot of the traffic has to slow down to go through the village to come out of the other side. We looked at options in previous consultation as to whether you could have a volume of growth that might justify or deliver a bypass, and we know from our experience of the Garden community how much roads cost and how quickly those costs can actually inflate over time as well. And we felt that a bypass linked to development here was not going to be a feasible outcome. But through the modelling work that Mr. Woods has described, we need to be assured that these level of growths, if there are mitigations that can be put in place, we try and incorporate those into the plan. But I don't see a big bypass scheme coming forward. But it may be that some comfort is taken by the proposals here in the wider Frinton and Walton area, that we are looking to reduce the numbers overall. So some of the concern about cumulative impact of development coming through Thorpe-le-Soken, it doesn't go away, but it is tempered to an extent by the fact that we are actually looking at quite a significant reduction of development in that area.
Come back, Councillor.
Thank you. No, that was a very good answer. Thank you.
Thanks so much indeed. Councillor Bush.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, question, Gary. It's always intrigued me and interested me the allocations, as Councillor Everett just said, the ins and outs, the additions, deletions in the enormity of this plan, what mechanism do we have for auditing that number for the accuracy year on year? And the reason I ask that is that it's when it's consent or when it's completed, and I just really don't understand to make certain that we're accurate and the numbers we've got at the moment are accurate, completed. I don't even know what stage it gets into that reporting mechanism so that we can cross-check and audit trail it.
Well, I'll start, and Paul, you might be able to help me out with some of the detail. But as part of the evidence base that sits alongside the local plan, and it's a piece of evidence that we do refer to in dealing with applications, particularly if you do have to deal with an appeal where housing supply comes up, we have the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment. Now, the last one of those was carried out in 2025. Paul and his team have carried out an update and a sort of finishing off the work on that, because that up-to-date version, which will give us an April the 1st, 2026 definitive position on where we are with housing supply, that's being worked on. That will form part of the evidence base. So by matter of course, we do an annual review of the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment. But I have had experience in the past where we've been in the process of dealing with lots of appeals, and almost the housing supply position ends up getting updated on almost like every few days if you get different appeal decisions. So we do need to bear in mind that if we do get into that scenario again, where we're ending up with dealing with a lot of appeals at the same time, there may be merit in doing interim updates to the figures within the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment and the trajectory in the housing supply. But that's how we keep on top of it. That's how we monitor it, typically on an annual basis, more frequently if we're forced to. I don't know, Mr. Woods, if there's anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, just one minor point, Councillor Bush. You asked when do new developments feed into that figure, housing supply. Within the SHLA, we list all of the large sites, which are 10 or more dwellings, that have planning consent, but also those which have a committee resolution to approve. So they're sites that we can have relative certainty that they are going to be developed. So those are the sites that we would count as our pipeline, alongside a prediction of how many small sites or windfall sites are going to be delivered each year as well. So that's when a site would enter our calculations at the stage that's either granted consent or has a committee resolution to approve. And then they sit alongside the emerging local plan allocations and the adopted local plan allocations.
Yeah, please. So if a particular site has had the consent, it might be sitting there for 2 years and it doesn't get built, it's in your system. So what the tick box when it says it's completed, so that number becomes accurate? I suppose I'm just looking at simple maths here, because I know a few sites that's been sitting there for some time, had consents, and it hasn't happened. And I'd just like to see how.
No, that's a very good question, and it is. It's on a site-by-site, case-by-case basis, and so each year our officers go and visit sites that are under construction, and physically count how many homes have been built each year, so that we can update the baseline. And so a particular site may have been granted consent for 200 homes, and then we review and see that 40 have been built so far. That means there's 160 left in the pipeline to us. For the sites that haven't been started, each year we correspond with the developers or the landowners to understand when that site is likely to come forward. We look at evidence that we have around Section 106 contributions and outstanding conditions that may need to be discharged to form an informed view of what the likely deliverability of that site is. And when you look at the SHLA, there's quite a nice, it's a colourful table in Appendix 5 that sets out year on year how many homes each site is likely to deliver. And you'll see that some of those sites are expected to deliver in years 1 or 2 of that chart. There are other sites that have got consent, but based on information from the developers or our own understanding of the constraints in an area, we don't expect those sites to deliver until years 4 or 5 or 6 or later. And there are a small number of sites with planning consent that we've just not got certainty they will be delivered. And so we tend to take a cautious approach with the assumptions that we make, because we know that there will be times when those assumptions need to be defended at appeal.
Cousin.
Right, Thank you, Chairman. I was just enjoying some of the debate tonight, and I mean it's unusual that we actually have a speaker. And I was sort of thinking of Will Votes speaking to us tonight, and listening to you, and you know, representing villages, I've been always very strong about keeping the identity of a village and stopping it being swamped by lots of housing, etc. But equally, I think that we need to look at maybe sustainability of little villages, and I think you raised the comment about Little Bromley and Little Bentley, and you know, I think the comment was made over here about the likelihood of getting a bypass for Thorpe. Well, I think also about the likelihood of getting main sewage into places like Little Bromley and Little Bentley, and whether you have to wait until it becomes like Crockerford Heath and you're going to get a huge, great development before you get main sewage. So I think with our emerging policy that's suggesting that, you know, an exception would be if there's no other way of doing it, then I just wonder whether, you know, perhaps we should be considering putting those back in, because I think the likelihood of ever getting main sewage into these villages is fairly unlikely. But I think also, you know, being someone who's always supported the strength of a village and how a village grows, you know, you want the growth to be fairly small rather than huge, great influxes of houses. And I think, you know, if we have got village shops there and a pub that we need to sustain, I just wonder whether perhaps we should be looking at this slightly differently, that it's a way to help the smaller villages become, you know, sustainable. So I just wanted to just sort of explore that, because I've listened to the odd little debates and the comments, and whilst it's a fairly small application, it has seemed to come up quite a lot tonight.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Cossens. I mean, we've seen that a number of sites across the district are proposed for amendment or deletion. The ones that are proposed for deletion in those smaller rural settlements are the ones in Little Bentley, Little Bromley and Tendring Heath. So I think if we were looking to make a change to reinstate one, you've got to look at changing to reinstate all three of them, because all three of those have been recommended for removal from the plan for the same grounds in response to that Anglian Water letter which we've spoken about. So what I would say is that from a soundness perspective, if we were minded to do that, I don't think it would cause a major issue with the soundness, because I think the policy does allow for those alternative forms of sewage provision. I think we were being a bit belt and braces in terms of sort of the cautious approach. I would also say that because that is the only planning ground on which those three sites were suggested for deletion, it wouldn't cause us any issues that we may inadvertently cause some other planning issue. And in the general principle of does smaller developments in rural areas helping the sustainability, of course we have that in other areas of the district, Beaumont, Rabness, you know, examples where we're not proposing to delete the site. So there is acknowledgement that there is a sustainability argument for a limited amount of development. I mean, if members were minded to request that those sites remain in the plan, as I say, I don't think we'll have a major soundness issue with that. We need to be prepared that we'll need to justify that when it comes to examination. I think we could, on the basis of what the policy allows for in terms of flexibility. But if we were looking to reinstate them, I would just suggest that for the site in Little Bromley, which was in the plan indicatively for 17 dwellings, when we were going through the process of reviewing which sites could come in or come out, if we were minded to include that or retain that Little Bromley site, we would have also been minded to recommend that we reduce the number on that a bit, because having revisited the position and looked at the density of the area and heard what people said to us when we went out to meetings, we feel that something at 10 as opposed to 17 would probably be a more appropriate indicative figure to go with if we were looking to keep that site in the plan. And that's not to say that planning applications for a different number couldn't come forward, but in the local plan, you have to give a view of what indicatively feels like the right level of development, having regard to a range of factors, and having revisited that one, if you're minded to put it back in the plan, we would suggest reducing the number from 17 to 10 on that particular site.
Do you want to come back?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that's totally sensible to reduce the number if that's what we're thinking, because my argument really is, I mean, we would allow no development in some of these villages at all if we wait for main sewage to get there, and I mean, there's one or two of us that haven't got an awful lot of faith in public sewers either. So, you know, my comment was really on the sustainability of the village to allow some growth to happen.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Cousins. I mean, if that is something that the committee wants to consider as a sort of formal amendment, what we've got to bear in mind as well, that we'll need to quickly recalculate what the overall numbers are. I know it's not many, much of an increase, but so that the resolution is accurate, not only would we need to have a look at that recommendation in terms of which changes that we're incorporating, we'd also have to look at what the overall impact of that is in terms of the overall number that comes out following that change.
Because we've also got to bear in mind the WICS reduction as well. So if that's the case, we'll finish the debate and then we'll tackle that all in one go at the end. I've got Councillor White there who wants to speak.
Thank you very much, Chairman. So far, I've been very impressed with the debate, and Gary, I think, has actually answered my question. But my principal point is that I'm worried about this reduction of the size of the buffer. And so really my question is, in taking these relatively small cases out, which will be slightly different, are we risking, if there'd been, for example, a change of government, a change of Prime Minister, a change of something like that, of cutting it down too far and reducing the size of our buffer? Would it not be better to keep our figures as originally constructed, so that we've got a little bit more tolerance? Really, that's the only question I've really got. We read nationally about what might happen if we had a change, for example, just of a Prime Minister. And if we get frightened with seeing the results of national opinion polls on the way the parties are going at the present moment, when certain parties have already declared that they want to throw out this whole new planning proposals. So it's very much a risk that I think we might be taking if we reduce the size of the buffer.
Thank you, Councillor White. Gary.
Thank you, Councillor White. And of course, you wouldn't expect me to be able to comment on the politics and what potential scenarios they might be going forward nationally. But what I would say about the buffer, and I completely understand the point, and I think we've been at pains throughout this debate to sort of emphasise that we are taking a risk by reducing the extent of the buffer. But there's a couple of things to say that historically, if we've been dealing with a target of 550 homes a year over an extended period of time, actually 10% of what that requirement would be, say sort of 11,000, you know, we could generally be able to accommodate that quite comfortably. I mean, 10% is not a hard and fast rule, but in my experience, you know, inspectors, they're given comfort if there's 10% flexibility in there, and they tend to not get too much into the detail. Obviously, we're proposing here reducing that buffer quite considerably, but you've got to remember that a buffer of 10% on 1,100 is a lot less number than a buffer of 10% on something that's near 18,000 homes. when that 18,000 homes is a figure that we've all openly debated, we think is quite unrealistic for our district for a whole range of different reasons. So to then be expected to have a big buffer on top of it brings into question how deliverable are the sites that you've included into your buffer. So it's a difficult one, a very difficult one. We won't be alone in having this debate across the country. But historically, it was always good practice, always sensible to have some contingency in your supply. And it was easier to do that in the days when the numbers were perhaps, more realistic in terms of our knowledge of the geography and deliverability. These new figures are extremely challenging just to deliver the 18,000. To then put a big buffer on top of that is challenging as well. But what I would say, the alternative of sticking with the numbers, of course, is that we stick with some of the sites that we know from our consultation have raised concerns, not only from large numbers of general public, but also from our technical consultees, whether that be concerns in relation to education, case of Thorpe, whether it be ecology in terms of Walton. And remember, these are the sites that we put forward as officers to this committee as the best of the bunch available, that we thought were the best ones that we'd assessed to bring forward this extremely high target. Now, if we were to look at lots of alternatives, we'd essentially be looking at inferior sites for inclusion in the plan to what we had before to make up the shortfall. We know it's going to be very challenging. We'll know we'll come under a lot of scrutiny, and some of that scrutiny will probably happen in an appeal table before we even get in front of a planning inspector for the local plan. But what I would say is that we've made members aware of the risk of reducing that contingency, but under the circumstances, we feel there is justification for it.
Thank you, Chairman. Just like to reiterate your thoughts, or your comments rather, about the quality of the report so far. Fantastic, aren't they? I wouldn't say they're easy to read because there's a lot in there, but I think the debate that you've had covers the points that have been raised, especially around the smaller sites. I can see the reasoning of taking out some of the sites. I'll make no bones about it. We've been imposed a figure that some people would say is impossible. We're never going to reach it. But the fact we've got to this stage is a credit to our officers. We need to progress this as quickly as possible, don't we? Because we need to get the plan in. Councillor Everett, I sat on the same committee with you, and to have to sit there and try and, I'd say, find reasons to refuse, but we're going to be in that situation for a little while. So the quicker we get this submitted, the quicker we can use the policies and our reasoning to fight off speculative applications. Some will get through. It's inevitable, unfortunately. But this is what's best for our area. Whether we ever achieve the number, let's wait and see. But I've just been having a quick look at the SLAR. I like the figures because the line goes above what we need to do yearly. So if we can achieve that, I think we'll be safe. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. And for the record, Councillor Baker is the Cabinet Member for Planning and Housing. And although he's not a voting member of the committee, you attend all our proceedings to keep an eye on us and how we conduct ourselves and how we progress the local plan. So thank you for your thoughts. The way the debate is gone is we're generally and reluctantly agreeing with what's been proposed, and officers have had a job from hell, really. You're doomed if you do, doomed if you don't, really. And we try to please everyone and try to take away as many flash points as you possibly have this time, and not so that they'll come back later on. The one thing that's come up is that reinstating of the three smaller sites, and I see quite a lot of nods around the table. If I may suggest, from what you said, Gary, about having to recalculate numbers, if I adjourn the meeting now, and we'll give you an opportunity to do some calculation and maybe with some form of amended recommendation to what we have in front of us. Is that okay? Is that doable?
I think so, Chairman. How long would you like to?
5 minutes, 5-10 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
I think so.
Is that enough time?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll adjourn the meeting for Okay, have we got everybody back in the room by the looks of it? Yeah? Oh, yeah. Councillor Chapman. Okay, so we'll start the meeting. Katie, thank you. Thank you very much, members, for your indulgence. I've been reminded to adjourn in one meeting. We broke a record, I think, didn't we? Okay, so we go to the wrapping up. Officers have very kindly drafted proposed amendment to the what's been recommended on the agenda, and I believe Councillor Cousins, you're happy to propose that.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to.
And Councillor Everett, you happy to second? Okay, so let's go to officers so they can read out the amendment, and then I'll go to the vote.
Thank you, Chairman. So with reference to the recommendations within the printed agenda, we're on page 378. The proposed amendment is to replace sections C and D of the recommendations, but that A, B, E, F remain unchanged. So the amendments are to replace C and D with the following. Under C, that the committee approves the officer's provisional recommendations for potential changes to site proposals in the draft local plan, as set out in this report and depicted on maps at Appendix 1, subject to the following amendments. 1. That sites MSA 19, Little Bentley, MSA 20, Little Brumley, and MSA 22, Tendring Heath, are not deleted from the draft local plan, having had regard to representations made by speakers and advice from officers. This is on the basis that these sites could make a valuable contribution to local housing supply, support the rural economy, and help the sustainability of local services in rural areas. And that whilst Anglian Water has advised against development in these locations where it is dependent on connecting to the public sewer network, there should be a reasonable prospect of these developments coming forward in line with relevant and adopted and emerging planning policies with appropriate alternative sewage treatment provision. 2. That in retaining site MSA 20 Little Brumley as a housing allocation, the indicative number of dwellings be reduced from 17 to 10 to better reflect the character and density of development within the village. 3. That site MSA 27 and Wicks be deleted, having regard to updated information provided by officers on the update sheet, indicating that the site is unlikely to be deliverable. And 4. That the recommended changes, together with the amendments set out above, form a working basis for further evidence-based work and the preparation of the submission version of the plan, and do not represent a final decision on site allocations. And then for D, which is a consequential change, D is to replace with, that the committee notes that if the provisional changes set out in this report with the amendments set out in C above, the potential supply of homes from proposals in a revised local plan alongside development that is already in the pipeline would be expected to total approximately 18,444, which would still exceed the total mandatory house building requirement of 18,173 by 271 homes, albeit with a much reduced level of oversupply and contingency from that indicated in the preferred options draft.
Thank you very much indeed. So it has been proposed and seconded. I'll go to the vote. All those in favour, please show. It's another unanimous vote. Thank you very much indeed, members. Would anyone kindly call Councillor Chapman back in the room? She must be feeling very lonely. I don't know if she's still here.
I feel responsible as a chaplain.
You're going to give her a bar of chocolate as well, are you?
Neat.
Yeah. I get those at the conference.
Yeah.
thank you very much indeed, Testing for again, Councillor Chapman back. And now we go to agenda item 8, which is report of the Corporate Director planning community adoption of the revised Essex Coast Recreation Disturbance Avoidance and Mitigation Strategy, known as RAMS. This report is on pages 421 to 669 of the agenda. It was prepared by William Fuller and Katie Patterson. It will be presented by Mr. Fuller and Mr. Woods. Over to you, Paul and Will. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. This report is asking members to comment on the updated Essex Coast RAMS, to recommend its adoption to Cabinet, including the revised tariff and updated governance arrangements. By way of context, the Essex Coast RAMS strategy exists to enable the Council to meet its statutory duties under the Habitats regulations. As members will be aware, those regulations require the Council as a competent authority to ensure that new development doesn't result in adverse effects on internationally protected habitats. In this case, this relates to the Essex coastline, which includes a number of special protection areas, SPAs, special areas of conservation, SACs, and Ramsar sites of international importance. The RAMS strategy provides a strategic Essex-wide solution to managing the cumulative recreational impacts arising from new housing, allowing development to proceed in a way that's both lawful and properly mitigated. The reason this update is being brought forward now is twofold. Firstly, there's been a significant increase in projected housing growth across Essex, particularly in light of the government's new house building targets across the county, which increases the scale of recreational pressure on these protected sites. And secondly, Natural England has formally advised that the existing strategy required updating, particularly in relation to the evidence base, the mitigation package itself, and the long-term funding for the mitigation. It's important to be clear that this isn't a new policy choice, it's an update to an existing established mechanism that the Council, along with other Essex authorities, has been operating successfully for a number of years. It's also important to recognise that it's not discretionary. Without an up-to-date and effective RAMS in place, the Council will be unable to lawfully grant planning permission for relevant residential development and will be exposed to a clear risk of delay and legal challenge. So it's something that the Council needs to keep under regular review and update rather than something that can reasonably be deferred. In terms of what's changed, the updated RAMS includes an updated evidence base, including new visitor survey work, a strengthened and expanded package of mitigation measures, and a revised tariff, which reflects the full cost of mitigation over the lifetime of new development. It also includes updates to the governance arrangements and the supporting guidance, which are set out in the report. But I won't go into those elements in detail, as Will Fuller is going to take members through the updated strategy and its components. So I'll hand over to Will.
Thank you, Paul. Welcome to the committee, Will. Over to you.
Thanks, Mr. Woods. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to try and keep this short because we are running quite late. The RAMS strategy needs to be supported by the relevant evidence. A big key part of that is going to be the visitor survey. The RAMS strategy itself, as stands, already has a visitor survey that was done in 2011 to 2013, so that's quite old now. So that's been updated. You can see it at Appendix 3 by Footprint Ecology. The results of that survey that was completed in 2025, so it is quite new, tell you the things I suppose you would already guess is the case. So people come to visit the habitat sites from local areas, so mostly within Essex, not really further afield. People come to walk, to exercise, and to walk their dogs. And for every 2 people that go to habitat sites, then we bring with them 1 dog. So the impact of dogs on these sites is quite significant, and it's borne out by the information here. And the distance in which people have travelled to come to these habitat sites directly influences the what's called zone of influence. So that's the area in which the RAMS strategy applies to. So that's all kind of information that we expected to kind of see, but it's good and right that it's all been updated and is now up to date. As Mr. Wood said, we do already have a RAMS strategy in place. It's we started work on it. Well, it was 2019. It really sort of formulated itself in 2021 when we began to actually collect contributions. Those contributions go principally toward, well, so far they've gone principally towards setting up the strategy. So things like getting in place a project officer to kind of guide the project, and under them there have also been 3 rangers employed, and they visit the habitat sites. They go around, they give information out, they tell people about the pros and cons of walking your dogs and disturbing the birds. They also have set up signage and information boards on sites, and they've also put in diversions and so to try and protect the breeding areas of the birds. So kind of all those things are kind of happening as it stands, but the new strategy that we're proposing here kind of builds on those things that are already happening. So with influence from Natural England, who have been a key part of this project right from the start, and it was Natural England who said we should review this. One of the key things that they were saying was about those wardens on sites should be upped from the 3 that we have at the moment to potentially 6, with 3 seasonal wardens as well. So it's more of a fair coverage. That actually runs more in line with other RAMS projects across the UK, because there isn't just this one in Essex. There's one on the south coast, and there's a number of others. And as to kind of ranges per area for Essex, you're looking at something like 500 kilometres or 300 odd miles of coastline, and for basically 3 or 4 rangers to patrol that amount of land isn't that great. So upping it to 5 or 6 plus puts us in line with these other areas as well. So that's kind of broadly the new parts. Additionally, where the RAMS group are looking to have their own vehicle fleet, so a van or 2 to visit more areas, to have a broader reach, and to produce more guidance, more signage, and to visit people, potentially educational establishments, so schools and like, to go and talk about birds on site and those things. So broadly, they're the kind of things it does. Members can see that the actual amounts being put forward do jump quite a lot. I'm not sure if Mr. Woods can whisper to me how much it is, but they are the main changes for this uplift in the tariff are twofold, really. Firstly, it's about this in perpetuity amount from Natural England, and what that is when the RAM strategy was first put together, the amount of contributions only went up to the end of the plan period, and then from that point, it would have to be kind of reviewed again. Whereas what Natural England wanted us to do was to say, well, how long will this? How much money will this be for the entirety of the project? And the amount of time they sort of said that was about 80 years. So it isn't kind of forever, but it's a fair time. So that was part of the reason why that expanded that amount. And then the number of dwellings proposed across Essex has pretty much doubled since the RAM strategy was first put in place. So that again kind of ups that amount. Yeah. So so now the amount is £476 per dwelling. Okay. So yeah, sorry, bear with me. Oh yeah. So the way in which the contributions are calculated, I mean, it's a fairly kind of rough and ready process. It is at Appendix 5, and that is it. The amount the mitigation package costs is kind of divided by the number of dwellings across Essex. They take off the amount that's already kind of in the pot because there's cash that hasn't been spent, and they take off the interest, and then that amount is kind of left with the amount you have left. I mean, I'm probably doing a terrible job of explaining it, but it's a fairly simple calculation. I think that's probably all I've got to say at the moment. I've probably forgotten stuff, and I'm sure Mr. Wood's going to give us the recommendation and tell me anything I've forgotten.
Or would you like to read the recommendation?
Great. Thank you, Chair. It's just a couple more points that I will just pick up around RAMS. Firstly, I think it's really good to highlight one of the success stories of the strategy. Just one statistic, at Colne Point in 2023, they identified 3 ringed plover, whereas in 2025, 49 were counted in a survey. So a significant increase in that particular bird there, which I think it demonstrates the value in this strategy. And then just picking up briefly on one point of governance that members will have seen in the report, the existing supplementary planning document, which sits alongside the RAMS strategy, is proposed to be withdrawn and replaced with a technical advice note. And this reflects changes in the national planning system, which mean that new supplementary planning documents can no longer be produced. There will be a new style of local plan being introduced over the coming years, and alongside that, a new type of supplementary planning document, which will just be called supplementary plans. And as such, the government have said that you can no longer adopt a new supplementary planning document or update them. And so in lieu of that, we've got a technical advice note, which gives a little bit more information about how the RAMS payment is to be applied through the planning process. And we need to ensure that the supporting guidance can be updated more flexibly and keep aligned with the strategy as it evolves over time. But it doesn't change the policy position, it just means that the guidance that supports the implementation of RAMS remains current and effective. And just to reiterate the position in terms of risk, because without an up-to-date RAMS in place, we wouldn't be able to conclude that there's no adverse effect on protected sites, and so we wouldn't be able to lawfully grant planning permission for relevant developments. So that would create the risk of delays in new development, and we understand the impacts of that on our housing trajectory, but also the potential risk of legal challenge. So maintaining an up-to-date and robust RAMS strategy is essential to the functioning of the planning system. So in that context, the recommendations are on page 422 of your agenda. It's recommended that the Planning Policy and Local Plan Committee notes the revised and updated Essex Coast Recreational Disturbance Avoidance and Mitigation Strategy, the Essex Coast RAMS, associated RAMS tariff, and proposed changes to the governance arrangements as set out in this report. And B, recommends to the Council's Cabinet that it 1. Adopts the revised Essex Coast RAMS and associated tariff as set out in Appendix 1, superseding the original Essex Coast RAMS 2018-2038 strategy. 2. Approves the implementation of a revised RAMS tariff of £476 per net additional dwelling or equivalent qualifying development to take effect from the 1st of August 2026. 3. Withdraws the adopted Essex Coast RAMS Supplementary Planning Document, SPD, noting that its content is no longer fully aligned with the revised strategy, evidence base or tariff. 4. Agrees to replace the SPD with an Essex Coast RAMS Technical Advice Note, or TAN. And 5. Delegates authority to the Corporate Director, Planning and Community, in consultation with the portfolio holder for housing and planning, to finalise and publish the TAN, Technical Advice Note, for use alongside the updated RAMS strategy. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul and Will, for presenting the report. Members, are there any questions? Are we happy? Councillor Everett?
Thank you. I have a probably dumb question. You mentioned that the costing was going to reflect the lifetime of the development. Am I still correct in saying that there will be a one-off charge and that there won't be subsequent charges later on?
Will?
Yes, that's correct, Councillor Everett. Just one payment.
Well, I'm glad I don't live in a New Forest. I've just looked at their tariffs.
Yeah, we've got away scot-free here, haven't we? Big jump though, still. Members, do we have a proposer and a seconder? Councillor Scott, a seconder. Councillor White has been proposed and seconded. We'll go to the vote. All those in favour, please show. And that's the third unanimous vote for the evening. Thank you very much indeed, members. Well, that takes us to the end of our agenda. There's no other further items. Thank you very much, everyone, for your input, debate, and officers for your sterling work you've done so far, and now the speed in which you have moved. And you have to keep it going if we are to meet that December deadline. If not, the consequences are quite dire on us. So we're straight back to square one again. Thank you very much. I'll close the meeting at